As the ultimate symbol of power, innovation, and heritage, here's how these mighty American V8s transformed the automotive landscape forever. Number 15. Ford Flathead. The Ford Flathead V8 is essentially the grandfather to all American V8 engines. Back in 1932, it was Ford who first began the V8 movement. While the engine layout had existed well before Henry Ford shot at it, Ford was distinct in that it made the 8-cylinder affordable to the masses. While the Flathead isn't exactly the most powerful or efficient unit, especially by modern standards, its strength was its simplicity. Not only was it incredibly easy to work on, but it was an extremely reliable engine for the time. It was so iconic that the first car it sat in, the Model 18, was simply known by most as the Ford V8. Number 14. Buick Nailhead V8. While this engine was called the Fireball V8 by Buick, its more popular name is the Nailhead. Enthusiasts gave it this name due to the unusual vertical alignment of its small-sized valves, which made them look like nails. The engineering of this engine meant that it output more than 1 pound-foot of torque per cubic inch, which was phenomenal for the time. This engine powered some of the most important Buick muscle cars of the era and helped them develop their brand in the 50s and 60s. It was even used as a starter motor for the SR-71 Blackbird supersonic jet. Number 13. Ford 427 Big Block. Competition is a great thing, especially in motorsports, as it inevitably graces us with astonishing powertrains. One such race-derived American V8 is the Ford 427. The engine is part of the Ford Y-Block series and comes in a few different versions. The most notable of them is the 427 Side Oiler, which was featured on the Shelby Cobra 427 SC. Another 427 variant was the SOHC Cammer, which was meant to beat the 426 HEMI cars in NASCAR. The final version of the engine was based on the 427 Side Oiler and featured improved lubrication and cross-bolted main bearing caps to handle more power. The result was a robust, high-performance engine that proved to be a HEMI slayer. While road-going variants were detuned due to emissions regulations, racing variants could produce over 650 horsepower. Number 12. Buick Small Block 215. In 1961, Buick developed a new small V8 that would come to power Oldsmobiles and Pontiacs, but would never sit in the heart of a great American muscle car. So why is it so special, you ask? Well, after General Motors had finished with the engine, they sold everything to do with it to the British automotive company Rover. While Buick never had much with their engine, Rover turned it into one of the longest-lasting production runs of an engine ever. It may not have seen its full potential under Buick, but it is still an all-American engine that sat at the heart of some of the most important British vehicles in history. Number 11. Ford Windsor 5.0. After Ford tasted success with their initial V8, they never stopped chasing glory. They were hooked on the configuration and continued updating their offerings. In 1961, they came out with the first in the Windsor family. The first of the 5-liter mills arrived later in 1968 to fulfill the regulations of the Trans Am Racing Series, in which 5 liters was the maximum displacement. This engine was housed in some of the most legendary Ford cars throughout history. It didn't take long for this powerhouse to catch on and quickly become the new favorite of enthusiasts. Number 10. Chrysler 426 Max Wedge. Before the mighty 426 HEMI, Chrysler gave us the 426 Max Wedge. The Wedgehead B-block design started in 1951 with a 331 cubic inch variant, until eventually displacement grew to 426 cubic inches. Like its successor, the 426 HEMI, the 426 Max Wedge was all about racing. The engine was designed for superstock racing and featured a compression ratio of 11 to 1 to 13.5 to 1, depending on the application. The Max Wedge also featured a cross-ram intake manifold with 2 staggered air cleaners. Another distinctive feature was the exhaust manifolds, which went up and down like a pair of snakes. Like the HEMI, the 426 Max Wedge was big and orange. Every aspect of the engine is over-engineered as it was meant to go fast and take a ton of abuse. Number 9. Chrysler 426 HEMI. After a short hiatus by Chrysler, the HEMI made a comeback in 1964 in the 426. HEMI refers to the shape of the combustion chamber, which is hemispherical. The late 60s signified the middle of the horsepower wars, a tough battle to see who could produce the most power, in which Chrysler's 426 sat as the benchmark. The 426 refers to the engine's displacement, which was 426 cubic inches. Originally, it was mainly developed to power their cars in NASCAR. However, the powertrain quickly became more popular than expected, and Chrysler extended the powertrain to the public. Number 8. Chevrolet L88 427. The big block Chevy 427 was extremely successful due to its versatility and its robust nature. The L88 model of the engine was used from 1967 to 1969 and was essentially a racing engine that fit inside production vehicles. It was most notoriously used in the Corvette and helped the Chevy gain its legendary status. While engines that output this kind of horsepower are fairly commonplace in the modern world, achieving a rating of 430 horsepower back in the 60s was an incredible achievement. Number 7. Cadillac 472 and 500 Big Block V8. One of the biggest American V8 engines put in a production car wasn't meant to be a performance engine. The 472 was exclusively meant for Cadillac's full-size luxury models, like the DeVille and Fleetwood. Despite featuring an over-square design, with a 4.3-inch bore and 4.06-inch stroke, the engine was a low-revving lump meant to produce massive, low-end torque, something that was needed to propel the nearly 5,000-pound luxury barges it was put in. In 1970, Cadillac introduced a 500 cubic inch variant of the same engine, featuring a different crankshaft for a longer stroke of 4.304 inches. This was good for another 25 horsepower and slightly more torque, although 1971 would see a sharp decline in performance due to smog regulations. Ironically, it is Cadillac that currently offers the most analog and driver-centric V8 sedan on sale. Number 6. Buick 455 High Output. Buick is one of the lesser likely names to appear when we talk about American muscle cars, despite making a ruckus in the 1980s with the GSX. Still, in 1970, the brand that was known mostly for making old man's commuters came up with a real showstopper that could easily run with the Chrysler HEMI and Chevy big block powered models. The Buick GSX Stage 1 was based on the rather mundane Skylark, but it packed a 455 high output V8. The 455HO benefited from new heads with bigger valves, a new intake, beefier internals, and a tweaked carburetor. It was also criminally underrated at 360 horsepower in its earlier versions. The 455HO Stage 1 also packed the most torque of any muscle car. Only Cadillac's 472 and 500 cubic inch engines produced more torque than the Buick 455HO. Good job done. Number 5. Chevrolet 454 Big Block. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, few things were cooler than a big block Chevy V8, and back then, the 454 Big Block was the king of the hill. Of course, there was the L88 427, which we already mentioned, but the only application where it made more power was in competition spec. The 454 was, typically, reserved for full-size muscle cars like the Chevrolet Chevelle SS, but also the C3 Corvette from 1970. The 454 came in a variety of power levels, but the most notable was the LS6, which is what the Chevelle SS 454 came with. There was also an LS7 version of the 454 Big Block, but very few were made. The 454 was a simple engine, and while it didn't feature hemispherical combustion chambers like other American V8s on this list, it was a very robust unit. It was in production until 2001, and since the bore and stroke were never altered, parts are interchangeable. Number 4. Pontiac 455 Super Duty. The largest engine ever produced by Pontiac was in 1970 when they released the 455 V8. A high-output 455 was released in 1971. The 70s saw a complete shift in the way engines were built due to shifting emissions laws. Pontiac was the last standing and held out with the detuned Super Duty 455 until 1976. Number 3. Ford Modular 4.6. Modular refers to Ford's approach to tooling and production at their production plants, something that the 4.6 fairly rare features, even among modern muscle cars, is the overhead cams, with loads of manufacturers still utilizing pushrod technology. There were versions of the 4.6 that utilized either 2, 3, or 4 valves per cylinder, using either a SOHC or DOHC setup, depending on the version. The 4.6 modular engine is incredibly robust and has proven its reliability. Number 2. Chevrolet LS1. Based on the architecture of the Chevrolet small block engine, the LS1 was built from the ground up. Its most notable application was also its first, in the Chevrolet Corvette C5. This was Chevrolet's big re-entry into the world of high-horsepower cars as they had tapered off slightly back in the late 60s. This is possibly the most well-known engine in popular culture, with the meme being that if you want to get power out of a car, you should just LS swap it. The Chevrolet LS1 has been dropped into anything from a Mazda Miata to a Porsche 911. Number 1. Ford 5-liter Coyote. One of Ford's most popular engine designs was their modular engines. These were a series of V8 and V10 engines that people had come to love. Despite being classified as part of the modular engines, the 5-liter Coyote engine was an all-new design and differed heavily from the rest of the lineup. The Ford Coyote featured twin independent variable cam timing and an extremely high compression ratio. The developments Ford made in the Coyote in terms of power and efficiency have influenced its engineering for years up to the present. Tell me in the comment which one is your favorite. Don't forget to like and subscribe.